All right. Today, we have a handful of things we're going to talk about. Gravity. Pull things to the ground. No. Sorry, did I get it wrong person? Yeah. Oh, must have been stuck. Sorry.
Yeah, start.
The first thing I want to address is an example like number 2 from your homework. So you can look at number 2, you can compare it to your APK, what you drew, and we're going to talk about what's going on in this example and why we're allowed to say certain things about it. So real quick, I want you guys to close your eyes or put your head down, however you can look at somebody else. I want you to ask yourself, so let's go ahead and do that. So close your eyes. Okay, we all know that there is a gravitational force and there's a force pushing up on the skater by the ice. I think everyone's pretty good at that. The question is there another force that is pushing the skater forward? Is there a force that's needed to keep the skater moving at a constant velocity? If you think there is a force, raise your hand. If you think it needs a force, put your hand up. Keep your eyes shut. Raise your hand real high. It needs a force. Okay, if you don't think it needs a force, put your hand up. Okay, great. Good. All right, let's bring it back. That was pretty about a good amount of you said that it didn't need one. Some people said it didn't need one. I'm going to pick on people. Ava, why did you think, so that you would answer honestly, so you would, because I won't get participation if everyone's looking at each other. It's alright, we'll make sure we're all on the same page by the end of the conversation. Do you think that, why do you think there might be a force? Oh, come on.
I don't know.
Why do you think there might be a force?
Why would it be moving forward without a force?
That's a great question. That's the question we're looking at. Why would something be moving without a force? Can we think about, well, I'm not going to say anything. Taquani, tell me about your answer.
Dang it. I thought it's something that wasn't said in the thing, which I thought like something was pushing it already.
Something's pushing it already?
Something pushed.
It was pushed previously, you
Yeah.
think? Yeah, so the skater pushed off the ice at some point, but now it's just gliding across the ice. The skater's just gliding.
Okay.
Ava's asking the question, why would something keep moving if it doesn't have a force?
But I had a previous.
It did, but now it's just moving. And there is a very important topic that we've discussed in this class that can help us answer this very well. Can anyone think about what we're kind of hinting at?
If something is moved and then pushed, otherwise.
Put it together. Come on, it's forming in your brain.
Yeah. If something's moving, then it'll stay in motion unless something is pushed.
Exactly. Ava, thank you, John. Ava, you probably can put this together in your head right now that your question of why would something be moving if it doesn't have a force moving it. Remember, forces don't cause movement. What do forces cause? Forces don't cause, to say forces cause movement is too vague. They will cause things to move, but they don't necessarily cause movement. They cause what? Velocity change, or in other words, acceleration, right? So if something's moving at a constant velocity, does it need a force to keep moving at a constant velocity? No. That's Newton's first law. An object that is moving at a constant velocity will remain moving at a constant velocity unless a force is acted on. Okay? So this example of a frictionless ice and no air resistance, that, in theory, it's not a very practical example because it's very hard to do things that don't, that have air resistance or friction or anything. This skater will not stop. There's nothing there to stop it. Therefore, it doesn't need anything to be pushed. It's just going to be in motion and it's going to stay in motion. So, when you draw your force diagram for the skater, you're going to put your force due to gravity. You're going to put your force of push, skater, ice, right? You do not need to add any kind of force like this that's force of glide or something like that. It does not need a force to be moving. It does not need a force to be moving. It only needs a force to change its velocity. And this has a constant velocity in the horizontal. Okay? We're going to start calling, you guys should be pretty comfortable with this. I'm going to start calling this our x direction and this our y direction. Okay? So we would say, I'll put a big X to cross this out. There are two forces in the y direction and they balance each other out. I should have had these. There's two forces in the y and they balance each other out. There are no forces in the x. So in the x direction, you would imagine that either the object is motionless, but we were told in the question that it already had a constant velocity. So if there's no forces in the x, it will remain at a constant velocity. Okay? Okay, so that's don't worry, it's a very common misconception that there's some force needed to keep things in motion. I think that misconception is probably rooted in the fact that there is always friction and there's always a little air resistance, right? Naturally, we know that skater will eventually slow down, and so they'll need to push off again to keep going. But the response to that is they're not just spontaneously slowing down. There's a contact between two surfaces or a force that's pulling them back. Okay? So the other class said it really well. They were trying to challenge me on the Newton's first law. That Newton's first law of something just staying in constant motion is extremely hard to see because everything gets slowed down by various factors. Where you can start to really understand it is by explaining why things do slow down. And the answer to that is always a force. Always a force. There's no spontaneous slowing down of anything. A force always causes it to slow down. And if there were no forces, if you could remove all the forces and get out into outer space, you should in fact see something just going on forever. Okay? Not changing. Very good. Okay. The main goal of today is we're going to practice drawing some more force diagrams in balance. And we're going to get some better names for some of the forces that we've been looking at. And we're going to name them some specific things, but put some definitions to them so that we know what they in fact mean. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you guys to draw force diagrams, and then I'm going to ask you guys to discuss them with your partner or group that you're with, and just check in. Make sure you guys agree on something. If you disagree, talk about it. You don't have to come to the same conclusion, but just have a little conversation so you have someone to help you out. Okay? So here's the first thing I'm going to ask you to draw a diagram. You can use FG for gravity, but make sure you put the labels on all the rest of the forces. Okay? So I want you to draw a force diagram for the anvil right now. Okay? Quick, so I don't have to hold out here. Maybe my shoulder stability work out here. Once you're done drawing the force diagram, go ahead and check in with your table or your group and see if you guys agree and have the same forces. It's just a very heavy thing to have in the classroom. more.
What was it, Ryan? Okay.
All right, and before we talk about them, I want you to go ahead and draw a force diagram for the anvil now. Okay, another one, maybe right next to it. You're drawing a force diagram for that anvil now. And then check in with your partner and
This is what you got?
all right, very good. So I've started them off here. We'll say this is the one where I was holding in. This is the one on the table. We need one more force on each of them, right? Which direction will they both be? Up.
Up.
Okay, this one will be force of, what do we want to call that?
Push.
Push by or on anvil by hand. And what do we know about related to the force of gravity? This force and this force?
About
Equal.
They're equal and they balance out. How's this one going to look compared to that one? What's the only thing that's going to be different? Yeah. The only thing is the dealer of the force. The table is now the one that is applying the force, rather than my hand. We're going to come up with a definition of forces that are applied by surfaces. So we'll remain calling anything that's applied by someone's hand or a kick or a throw or something like that is like a pushing force. But whenever we have a surface applying a force, like this one, we're going to give it a special name. Does anyone know the name that we're going to call that? I wouldn't expect you to. Do you know it? I did? Can you?
Is it a neutral word?
Close.
Ah.
Normal force. Normal force. So we're going to write a definition here. And we're going to come to a, oh, don't write that. Normal force. Normal force. The definition, we're going to start it as the force applied by a surface. So, in other words, the surface of this table is applying a whole lot of normal forces right now. Every single one of these objects is subjected to gravity, and therefore every single one of these objects must have a balancing normal force on this table, or we would see them accelerating. So there's a normal force on a basketball, there's a normal force on my coffee, there's a normal force on that basket of markers, there's a normal force on the pencil sharpener. I want everyone to take your thumb. I want you to push down on your desk. Okay, so we're applying a downward pushing force. Talk to your group about what other forces are acting on. If you were to draw a force diagram for your thumb, you don't have to. If you were to draw a force diagram on your thumb, what would be acting on it?
Table. Normal force.
So what are you feeling? Like you feel something in your thumb? Why do you feel pressure? Because you're pushing the table is pushing back in here. The table is pushing a force up and down. That's what you're actually feeling. If the table weren't there, you wouldn't.
Oh yeah, I see.
All right, so Martin's gonna help us out here with the class. We all felt something when we pushed into the table. Martin, what did you feel in your thumb? Can you explain what might have been causing that? Yeah, the table was pushing back, right? The table was applying a normal force on your thumb, right? So inanimate objects like tables and floors, we hope that they apply forces. If the floor didn't apply a force, then we'd all be cracking through the floor and going into the ground, right? So inanimate objects are constantly applying normal forces. Surfaces are applying normal forces up on, or at some other direction on objects applied by surface. Okay, so now we're going to move to this little block and board setup. Board, block, okay? So those are your two words you need to know. Block, board. I want you to go ahead and draw a simple, using some terminology we just came up with. Draw a force diagram for just this system. Don't include my hand in it. Just the board block system. Okay? So it's just resting on the board. Okay, everyone good? We're pros at drawing simple force diagrams now. What do we call that force by the board? The normal force, right? The surface of the board is applying a normal force onto the block. All right, now here's the most important part. This is a, this is an incomplete definition. We're going to add a little bit more to it. And what's going to help us is this little thought experiment. So you're going to draw one more force diagram for this system. I'm going to change it in a second, and you guys are going to talk about with your group if things change, if things don't change, what do we expect the force diagram to look like. Quick note. Friction is going to play a role in this next part. I want you to set aside friction for a second. We're going to ignore it. We're going to get to it after this conversation. All right, so here we go. Ready? You're going to draw a force diagram for this. Don't worry too much about the friction right now. Did anything change? Draw a force diagram, talk about it with your partner. I'll leave it propped up. Right here. Checking with each other. What do you guys think?
Instead of the board.
You guys disagree? Do you disagree with me? Looks like it.
Oh, dang it. But gravity is the cosine.
Okay, are you talking about this? Do you guys all agree?
What? No, you probably should do it.
There's no way about books yet.
Yeah. Well, sounds like you were. We'll talk about that later. Make sure you agree or disagree on this.
I have issue.
All right, so we're back here. Okay, so I kind of walked around. I saw a lot of people seem to agree that not much changed. So here was our diagram for just the block. We have, of course, gravity, and then we had a normal force on block by board. That's a little notation you just put an N there for normal force. And they were equal, right? And then we have our new diagram of it at a tilt. So it looks like a lot of you guys agree that the diagram will not change. You'll only see these two forces, right? Jaquani, I'm going to ask you about one of your forces. Which way does gravity point? Does that ever change?
I fixed it. It's fine.
Okay, so you changed that. You had gravity at an angle. To match this angle, you drew gravity like this. Is that true?
Actually, mine was worse than that.
It was a little more at an angle. That's okay. That's a good mistake to make at first. That you think, oh, the surface changed and the force of gravity might be changing. But when we do like a reality check, we remember that gravity only pulls things straight down. That's the only way it can act on an object. So gravity will never change to be something like that. Gravity will just point straight down. Now the question is, did the normal force change? Did the normal force change? Think about what's applying the normal force? The board is applying the normal force. Did the orientation of the board change?
Yeah.
So do we think that the normal force might change a bit?
Yeah.
In fact, it does. And that might not be the most easiest thing to see. But when we change a normal force, we had our normal force pointing up like this. When we see a board change, the normal force actually changes with the surface. It changes with the surface. So, whoa, a little too much there. Overcome friction. What might be the best way we could say the normal force is related to the surface? What's a mathematical way we could say it? How are they related? They're always
On the same axis.
not on the same axis.
Oh wait.
Quite
There's
perpendicular. There you go. Javon got it. They're perpendicular to one another. So the normal force always points perpendicular to the surface. So we'll add that to our definition. It's a force applied by a surface that points perpendicular to the surface. You can also write perpendicular as a sign like that. Perpendicular to the surface. So we would expect to see the normal force on this diagram to look like that. The normal force changes so that this is a right angle, like that. Create a right angle to the surface. Okay? Now we know that if I show you this side of the board, very smooth surface. If I start to tilt it what happens right there? What could we? A force? Is there a new force that all of a sudden comes into play, or is it
Yeah.
The forces become unbalanced.
the forces become unbalanced? Would be the best answer. Gravity's always there, but all of a sudden it becomes out of balance, and then you see an acceleration, right? So we haven't talked a whole lot about unbalanced forces, but we know when things start accelerating that they are no longer in balance. If I flip it over to this side where we have sandpaper, we have a slightly different situation. So we know that something is acting on this that wasn't acting on the other side. With your partners in your group, two things. What type of force is acting on it, and where is it pointed? If you're going to add another force to this diagram, where would it be pointed, and how can we explain that? So, 30 seconds with your partners. What is the mystery force, and which way would it be pointed? Hint, I told you to ignore the mystery force at the start, and now we're not ignoring it.
Ooh.
Got it, Martin?
I think he did.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Wes. Leo. Leo.
Are we all balanced?
Mystery.
Wait,
What is that?
wait, they're both not quite here.
Because the force of gravity points down.
Huh?
Oh, I thought I had it.
I
Unless pushing
like
on
that.
it on top.
Did you get a force on here? Busy?
Pushing it down.
Okay. Good. Alright.
What is it now?
Talk about that one. That's looking pretty. Rachel, can you come up with an explanation about where it's pointed in relative to other things in the picture?
Yeah, yeah, I've seen that.
So I'd be like,
You get that? What is that?
That's good. What's holding it? What's holding it back there?
Okay, which one is it?
You know what we call that force?
The force.
The contact between the two surfaces. The frictional force. So we're trying to see where would that frictional force go on this diagram? How is it? We're gonna come there. All right, so what's the name of this mystery force?
Since it's going this way, does that mean it's just going the opposite way?
Hold on, we're gonna talk about the direction in 1 second. Friction, let's start with the name. It's a frictional force. In other words, we've been calling friction, what's a long-winded definition of friction? More detail?
Oh,
Towards-
contact between two surfaces.
Contact between two surfaces. So, friction force is force provided by the contact between two surfaces. Dot, 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 there's a little more. So that's where we kind of left it off. Rachel, can you help us out with the direction of friction? There's
like,
two parts to it. Go for it.
the friction is like holding it upward, and so it's preventing it from going down.
Okay, good. So it's, if we kind of put that into language, it would oppose the direction of motion. Right? We would expect that this would slide down, right? And so you're saying that it would hold it up, so it's going to pull it this way. Now, is it going to pull it up like this way? Is it going to pull it up this way? It's right, what would you say? How would you say right? Parallel or along the surface, right? Got that, John? So, two surfaces, and it points points along the surfaces, and I'll say in parentheses parallel. So it's parallel to those two surfaces. And always opposes the direction of motion. So think to yourself, where do you think this block is going? Would you expect it to go? I mean, I would say, well, all we gotta do is take the sandpaper away and we can see where it would go. It wants to slide down there. And so the opposition to that motion would not be down the hill, but rather
Up the hill.
up the hill, right? So, so our force of friction is going to be right along the two surfaces, opposing the direction of the motion. And if we label it, we're going to say force, friction, on block. What's causing it? The two surfaces. So sandpaper and the block. It can't just be the sandpaper. If there was sandpaper on the block as well, then you'd probably even have more friction.
Are they
Come
all
on.
valid?
Hold on, fine. No, I'm gonna answer yours. I said Connie. Here's what I'll say, Rachel. The whole diagram is balanced. These three are not, none of them are the same amount. We're gonna hold off on how to do these and figure out that balance right now, because it's gonna involve a little more detail. But we're gonna focus today on getting these three forces on the diagram. But you can ask yourself, you can do a quick check, is this block, should it have balanced forces? Yes. So somehow, we'll have to figure out how they're balanced. We're not going to do that today. But somehow we will figure out that they're balanced. Okay? Come on, any question?
Is there an abbreviation?
Yeah. You can write force of friction. Actually, you can write force of friction is usually like that, with like a curly F. The normal force is N. We know gravity. Okay, and real quick, the last part. I can make the same force diagram. I'm going to flip back over to my sliding side. This is going to be the exact same force diagram, right? And this helps us understand how friction is holding that block up along the parallel surface, because this is going to do it's providing the exact same motion. We're just using a slightly different force. Now we're using a piece of string instead of, if I don't have the string on here, that force has got to pull it up this way, right? That's why that friction force is along that. This is going to provide the exact same force diagram. Exact same force diagram. And it gives us our last definition of tension. Tension is a force, any pulling force, sorry, a pulling force. A pulling force applied by rope, string, etc. So anything that's applied by a rope, anything that's hanging, you can call that a tension force, because there's tension in the string. If I pull down on this, we're creating more tension in the string than if I'm just letting it rest, because there's more tension force in that string. Okay? Good? All right. For the remainder of the class, you guys are going to take this little quiz. All right? Don't stress out. It's straightforward. It's not really... here's what I'll say. If you want to add the new terminology onto the quiz today, you can. If this didn't make as much sense in terms of naming things, you can still use the old way, like push or pull, or holding or something like that. I'm gonna ask you to draw 3 force diagrams, and there's 2 quick written responses on the back, okay? It should take you 6 minutes. So let's put everything away off your desks.
We're gonna figure it out.
What's that?
That's the last thing.
Here's the last thing. Then you can go to sleep. If you finish, you can use the rest of the class as you like. Well, seniors can go in 6 minutes, so as soon as you're done, you can leave. Martin, can you sit over in a second?
Yeah, I'm ready.
How did you know? Come on, can you spin your desk?
Yeah, it's funny.
I thought,
You guys spin your desks out just a bit. Just say that. Come on. The quicker that you do it.
spin more.
Alright, no talking from now on. It's not the 25th. It's the 28th. I'm back. I'm sorry. I shouldn't even put the date up. More wrong than it is right.